once or twice, but I'm not particularly a hardcore hackathoner. So I was wondering if you guys ever did CTFs. I mean, that was something I had a lot of fun with when I was getting into cybersecurity.
Let's see. As for CTFs, we did get started on CTFs last semester, of which we did pretty well for our first time and
That's awesome.
representing our school.
Congratulations. Yeah, there's a lot of like I don't know what the right word is, but like specialized knowledge, like you can kind of get better at them. A kind of funny story related to that is once we did a CTF that had been set up. I was in high school and we were doing it set up by a bunch of college students, and it wasn't, most CTFs like are kind of remote based, like you have to sort of get the keys off of like remote servers or something. But this one, it was like securing a local like Linux install, and all the like flags were hidden in different spots of the Linux system that were vulnerabilities. But the funny thing is that a Linux system is like entirely flat, like text files. So one friend in our group was very skilled with regex, and she went and wrote a regex script that went through every file and looked for anything, any string of characters that kind of looked like one of the flags that we were supposed to submit, and hit enter. And then we got like 90% of the flags right away without actually knowing how to secure that system. So that was a kind of, if you ever get it set up like that, you can run regex.
Regex continues to haunt me. Like that was one of the areas that I was working on during one of the CTFs last semester, and I couldn't for the life of me get regex, but maybe I can get it this time around.
I don't think I can write regex either. I mean, I normally just write Python. That's if I have the string parsing gets complicated enough that it's some type of regex that I can't write that well, I'm like, I'll just write a custom program in language of choice to process this. But another weird with the forward lookups, negative lookups, and the grouping. I'm like, no, I don't. That's programming language people. They really like that stuff.
And it's interesting you mentioned like the different specializations too. Like I was very surprised to see a cloud category for the Hack the Box University CTF.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, no, well, cloud is really big. I mean, we can't stop talking about it. I think my favorite word for cloud was someone's like there is no networking, people don't even like the term cloud that much, because at the end of the day it's always actually a server. But my favorite reference to cloud is just someone else's servers. But in the business space, they've essentially dominated. I mean, like everything. Like one of my funniest things is Princeton. Actually, we run our Princeton.edu out of the real Princeton campus for whatever reason that like eludes me. So if you ever want to DDoS Princeton, just hit their .edu webpage there. But the VPN.princeton.edu, the ever so secure connection to Princeton's campus, is actually run out of Google Cloud. So, you know, there's nothing that you can't outsource these days.
Nice. Let's see. Michael, I think maybe I misunderstood. Are we ready to go?
Yeah, we're gonna have everyone join virtually because
you can type in the chat. My bad.
Yeah, we're good to go whenever you guys are.
Awesome.
Okay, so I think then we're good to go. Okay, so to start this off, my name is Henry Birge-Lee from Princeton University. I'm a research software engineer in the electrical engineering and computer science departments. Today's presentation is on multiple vantage point domain control validation, which is making the PKI more resilient to network attacks. So largely, this is a presentation kind of about certificate authorities and their operations. So certificate authorities are essentially the holders of these private keys, trusted cryptographic keys, and their job is to vouch for the authenticity of every web page you visit. So over HTTPS. This is just a screen. Oh, also, I'm happy if anyone wants to interrupt me at any time during my talk. But just for an example, this is a screenshot of my connection to google.com. And the real thing here is that we can, encrypt this connection and everything. But the question that we're trying to answer here is authenticity, or authentication, I should say. How do I know that I'm actually talking to a server that is owned and operated by Google and not just, say, Mallory, who is posing as Google. So you could imagine that if Mallory can hijack this connection, Mallory could just say, oh, I'm google.com. Please send your login info to me. And the way that this is solved on the internet is that these certificate authorities, like Google Trust Services, as you can see here, which is a kind of interesting subdivision of Google, but it's actually its own certificate authority. They go and they sign trusted digital certificates for different web pages. And when I connect to google.com, essentially the google.com server sends me this signed digital certificate that says, I am google.com, and you know I'm google.com because Google Trust Services signed the certificate and said so. So that's essentially the infrastructure that's securing every HTTPS connection that you ever go onto. But underpinning that is this process of how do certificate authorities actually sign these certificates? So we've established that if Google can present to me this cryptographic certificate proving who it is, I know I can trust that and I can send my data to Google. But how does, say, Google Trust Services actually know that that's the real google.com? And what happens is that when a CA signs a certificate for a domain, they need to establish the identity of that domain. And this is done with a process known as domain control validation. And domain control validation is essentially the root of trust for all of these connections. So I trust google.com largely because Google Trust Services believes that that server is actually google.com. And that's done with domain control validation. But what I want to talk about today is actually the attacks on the internet's routing protocol, which is called the Border Gateway Protocol. And this interestingly actually undermines this root of trust for our encryption. And I think it might be a little bit hard to fully touch on, but there's an interesting irony here that the encryption of HTTPS is supposed to be securing us from these types of routing attacks. But because we have the routing attacks, we can no longer trust the encryption of HTTPS. So largely my work has been trying to get around this. So I want to take a moment to talk about domain control validation and give kind of a specific example and a little bit more about what this actually means. So imagine that I am the owner of a website, example.com. And right now I'm http example.com, but I would like to become https example.com. And that means I need a trusted certificate for example.com. So I'm going to go up to one of these certificate authorities and I'm going to say, can you sign me a certificate for example.com? And this is known as a certificate signing request. Now the certificate authority can't accept this at face value because if I didn't own example.com, or let's say I didn't own google.com, potentially I could just approach any certificate authority, ask for the google.com certificate, and then I could pose as google.com. So they present to you what's called a domain control verification challenge. And that's often of the form of simply putting a piece of information at a specific URL at that domain. So the idea is that by uploading content, this specific piece of content to example.com/verify.html, I'm proving that I have some type of control over example.com and I'm worthy to receive this certificate. So essentially the way the flow is supposed to work is that I go and I modify my own web server at example.com, putting the content there, and then I tell the certificate authority, hey, I did that. And then the certificate authority checks that the content's actually there. So this, again, is just a good old HTTP GET request because I don't yet have a certificate, so it can't be HTTPS. And then presuming the content's all good, the certificate authority signs my certificate. But what's really interesting is that right here, in order to establish HTTPS for the first time, we have to rely on a good old HTTP connection between the certificate authority and the web server. So it makes us wonder what happens if an adversary can actually hijack this HTTP response and send back the content even when the real web server at example.com doesn't have it. So essentially, if an adversary launches a BGP hijack against this request, it can get the content back to the certificate authority, and then the certificate authority will falsely think that the adversary controls example.com when it doesn't. So now I want to take a moment to talk a bit about some real world attacks on this process. So as I mentioned, this is incredibly crucial sort of underpinning of all HTTPS connections. And what I would say was interesting to me, at least, is that back when I was doing this work a lot earlier in 2018, there was this hijack on a cryptocurrency website. It was called MyEtherWallet. The attack was actually very successful. So as I was mentioning before, there's a little bit of a user sort of error message signaling flavor to this as well. That even though when people, well, let me back up a little bit. The method of the attack was that adversaries launched a BGP hijack, which allowed them to redirect backbone internet traffic from the real myetherwallet.com to an adversary-controlled server, but they had not fooled the certificate authorities. They did not get a certificate. So when people went to MyEtherWallet during the attack, they saw this error message. This is a warning produced by the browser saying that, hey, we're not actually seeing the right certificate here and you might be under attack. Now, what's interesting is that you notice the X, that at this point, people could actually X out of the warning, and a lot of people bypass this warning, actually put their credentials in anyways, and got their money stolen. Since then, and kind of as an ongoing effort, these warnings have been getting harder and harder to bypass. Nowadays, I don't even think you see an X anymore. You actually have to manually add the malicious certificate to your certificate store. You can't just tell them to bypass it on a one-time case. But there is an interesting point that none of this matters if people can simply bypass this warning. But in 2018, there was an attack on this cryptocurrency wallet, but users still saw this warning because they hadn't gotten a malicious certificate. What was really interesting is that in 2022, these attacks actually evolved, and we've actually seen a string of attacks on cryptocurrency websites where the adversary actually went to a certificate authority after launching their BGP hijack and obtained a malicious certificate. So this is an example of an attack known as the clay swap attack, which happened in 2022. And essentially, users of this service were blindly giving their money to the adversary because the adversary had hijacked one of the connections with a BGP hijack. And instead of having this warning or some type of error, the adversary went and approached a trusted certificate authority known as 0SSL and obtained this malicious certificate for developers.kakao.com, which was hosting this really important JavaScript file. And they used that instead of the sort of original certificate for star.kakao.com from Digicert. So we have this situation now where users are visiting this page, their connection's actually being hijacked, so the security of HTTPS is being undermined, but they don't see anything because they're seeing this malicious certificate. There was another attack on Seller Bridge. Once again, you can see here the malicious certificate has been revoked by everybody, but that's not after these attacks did substantial damage to these cryptocurrency websites. And I should mention that the methodology of this attacker was essentially to use these malicious certificates to trick people into thinking they were going to these real cryptocurrency services and then actually steal millions of dollars of their cryptocurrency. So it was quite devastating in the end, and a lot of users lost their money. And there's a lot more that you can do when you can subvert any HTTPS or even any TLS connection across the internet. So now I want to talk a little bit more about BGP attacks and how they operate. So I mentioned that if an adversary can hijack that connection from the certificate authority to the domain in the domain control verification process, that was sufficient to essentially get a certificate for a domain you didn't control. And there are several ways that you can actually attack this connection. Some of them have to do with DNS hijacking, but the one that our group's particularly interested in is known as BGP hijacking. So BGP is the routing protocol that runs on the backbone of the internet. It's how independently operated networks, known as autonomous systems, exchange routes with each other. So an autonomous system would be something like your ISP. If you're on a home connection, your university is most likely its own autonomous system. It gets internet connectivity from other ISPs, and BGP is essentially how people know which ASs to route your traffic to. But we have this scenario in BGP where it was invented about 20 years ago, and there's no default like authentication built into BGP. There's a lot of ways that we try to authenticate these routes kind of on top of BGP, but essentially it's not all that hard to simply take an example and say, so I'm sorry, there's a little jump in this slide since I adapted it from a different presentation. But if you notice here in BGP, this AS up here is claiming that it owns the IP prefixes 222.0/23. And in this scenario, example.com is running on this IP prefix, and this presumably is the legitimate owner of that block. So BGP is routing all the traffic to these guys. Now, an adversary can simply go and say, well, I instead own 222.0/23. And as I mentioned, this is largely unauthenticated. So there's no actual way of verifying that this guy did not own these prefixes, or even more sophisticated, that this guy might have a link to that real guy who owns the prefixes. So it's actually quite complicated to verify and find out that this is malicious. And in this scenario, now internet traffic will be redirected from the victim over here down to the adversary. So this is a very effective way of getting traffic from the certificate authority to go to you instead of to the real victim website. And over here, you can see the certificate authority now, when it tries to send traffic to example.com, instead of going up to this corner of the internet, its traffic's just going to go down to the adversary, letting the adversary pose as example.com. But I think a really important takeaway from this, and it's not true universally, not all BGP hijacks are local, but in fact, many of these attacks are actually only local to a portion of the internet. So some of the internet will actually continue to believe the real AS's route and sort of continue to route traffic to the good guys at example.com, while some of the internet is now going to believe the adversary's fake route. So this divides the internet into an affected portion and a hijacked portion. So with this in mind, I want to talk about a really important mitigation to these attacks. And as I mentioned, this is a mitigation, not a full prevention. But essentially, we can leverage the fact that we now have sort of two portions of the internet. And we could imagine, what if we perform this verification from multiple spots all around the internet? So this CA is now not only doing its own verification, but it's enlisted the help of this remote verification vantage point up here that are both going to go and verify the domain at example.com. So in this case, the CA's own traffic is going to go down to the adversary and make it think that the adversary owns example.com, not what we want. But this remote vantage point is in the unaffected portion of the internet, and its traffic is still going to go to the real example.com. So with this in mind, we can simply have a policy at the CA to only sign a certificate if its original check and the checks at these remote vantage points agree. This way, we can prevent signing the certificate for example.com because we're able to find out that the real example.com had never completed domain control verification by using this remote vantage point. So I want to talk a little bit about how effective it is, and I think I'll go fairly quick over this section as it's quite deeply technical, but there are many factors about real domains and how they're hosted that impact sort of how effective this is. And we just completed kind of recently a very large study on what's happening to domains. We ran a lot of internet topology simulations. So we modeled BGP hijacks on the internet using different security configurations. And we also did a really good job of trying to simulate the routing at cloud data centers, because Let's Encrypt, who we've been collaborating with for a while on this, they're very interested in deploying these vantage points at different cloud data centers. So we wanted to take extra care to make sure we got the routing there correctly. We also looked very deeply into DNS and emerging security technologies in the DNS ecosystem, like DNSSEC. We looked into a sort of a recent, I wouldn't say competing, but a recent work in this space talking about how you could steer certificate authorities to DNS servers of choice and trying to pick out vulnerable DNS servers when there are many. And overall, we launched sort of this multi-month study where we randomly sampled 10,000 certificates from each day's log file. We got log files shared from Let's Encrypt. And over the course of the experiment, we were able to sample 810,000 certificates and 1.3 million domains. We did full graph DNS lookups, which is just kind of this methodology of trying to find out every part of the attack surface associated with that domain. We modeled 19 data centers across AWS, Azure, and GCP, and we ran 400 million full internet topology simulations to sort of compute what might happen when an adversary launches these attacks. And what we found is that even in light of kind of this huge number of factors, multi-VA actually significantly improves the resilience of CAs to these attacks. So simply reading these two graphs, on the left one, we have the multi-VA case. On the right one, we have single VA or VA stands for validation authority. You can start to think of it as the CA's vantage points. But with when we run multiple vantage points, we see a huge improvement in the resilience. So the y-axis of these graphs is what we call effective resilience, and it's sort of how much of the internet are you topologically, defended from BGP attacks. So the higher it is, the more people cannot launch an attack against you. The lower it is, the more vulnerable you are to attacks. And if we notice on the left graph, oh, and then on the bottom, it's a CDF. So these are the proportions of domains. So the median sort of average case domain is right here in the middle at x.5. Our most secure domains are on the right side of the graph, and our least secure domains are on the left side of the graph. And what we see is that this median domain does much better under multiple vantage point validation than single vantage point validation. And the different lines are sort of under different modeling conditions and different future security parameters. And then we also looked a bit about how this could be made better. It turns out that if you can add vantage points, particularly those in other cloud providers, we can sort of get up to these high 98.6 numbers for the resilience of the median domain. So particularly as a mitigation, I think getting the median domain up to the high 90s is quite substantial since we're starting at kind of a resilience baseline. It's best represented actually by this green one of about 50%. So it's really nice that we can get into the high 90s for these domains that previously were only resilient to attack from 50% of the internet. We also looked sort of at quorum policy. I won't get too much into this, but Let's Encrypt for reliability reasons allows one vantage point to fail. It turns out that you do better with security if you don't, but that's a great example of kind of the trade-offs that we have to make between the engineers and the security people. There's never a great answer with full security. You're always going to be pushed up against practical constraints and what the engineers and what the business people feel comfortable with. And quorum is one of those trade-offs, but you do get a lot better if you can change the quorum policy, jumping us, 7%, pretty much 8%. And then finally, I think I want to talk about what I'm most excited about this project, and that's that we're largely kind of on the brink of what I think is a tipping point where this might become the industry standard. So right now, we've collaborated for quite a while with Let's Encrypt. They have a deployment of multiple vantage point validation. Google Trust Services also independently made a deployment, which we're really excited about. Cloudflare has released an API, so they are and they aren't a CA. They're kind of a complicated situation, but they've released this API so that smaller CAs can actually implement this without having to deploy these actual vantage points. They simply send an HTTP REST call to Cloudflare's network, and then Cloudflare does it for them, and they get the result back. And then we've got interest from many of the top CAs in doing this, which is really exciting. And I think most exciting for me, and I'd appreciate it if you don't share this point broadly because it still hasn't been announced publicly, but the Chrome root program, which is essentially Chrome has a list of which certificate authorities they trust, and they can unilaterally decide not to trust somebody. So they have these guidelines for why should we trust you? And you have to do X, essentially. And they are looking at putting this as a requirement in a future version of their sort of requirements document. And then we're also looking to hopefully have a vote at the CAB forum, which is the governing body for all CAs. It's kind of the relationship between the Chrome root program and the other root programs and the CAB forum is quite complicated. But largely, either one of these would mean universal industry adoption. So we're hoping to go forward with the vote as well. And I think it's a really exciting body of research because we've actually been able to see some real world change in the industry because of this work that, as I said, has spanned many years. So I want to end by taking any questions. And then, as I mentioned, we've also written 3 papers on this in our group. It's going all the way back to 2018. So anybody interested, I'd be happy if you wanted to look at our papers more. Yeah.
Let's see, just to make sure, are you able to see the chat, Henry? If not,
Oh,
I
no,
could
I
read off
think-
the questions.
Yeah, could you read off questions? I'd appreciate that.
Yes. So first question is from Ian or Ian, I bet. What kind of protocols are you using for the individual verifications in MV? Is it the same process as single validation?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So largely, and I think this actually touches upon sort of a more interesting movement in the industry as well. Largely, domain control validation was sort of just recently standardized. The only real document standardizing it across the industry is this CAB form or CA and browser form baseline requirements. And it simply says that you can do it. Oh, it has about 10 different methods. Some of them are quite sketchy, sort of out of band things, like you can telephone call the administrative contact listed for a domain. In terms of core like technical ways, I think it largely boils down to what I would say are two. One is HTTP, so please put, well, let's say three. One is HTTP, so please put a piece of content on an HTTP server at the domain. The second one is DNS. So that is please upload a specific DNS record underneath that domain that we can look up with our DNS resolver. And then the third one is email. So please answer an email sent to one of these about 5 administrative email addresses, which in themselves are not even particularly well defined. Like there's a definitive list of what they are, but why those were chosen is another question. So there's actually a lot of lack of standardization among these protocols, but they do largely boil down to they're essentially all hijackable. And that is because they can never assume that you have a certificate to do this. At some point, you need to verify trust that first time. I think of it a little bit like a leap of faith. So you have to use some type of unencrypted, unauthenticated protocol to contact that domain, find out they are who they say they are, and at that point forward, you sign the certificate, and then you try to encrypt everything. And then down the stream, these are TLS certificates. So they're always being used, or you might have heard of them as SSL certificates. They're always being used in SSL, and it's protocols built on top of SSL, which largely right now is being dominated by HTTPS. But yeah. I could also try to see if I can see the chat on my screen. Yeah, here, let's see. I can bring up I can just stop my share probably.
Sure.
And bring up chat now. Oh, Teams. Do you mind reading off the next question, actually?
Of course. So the next question is from Rose Ramirez. Are these slides going to be available?
Yeah, I could make the slides available. As I said, I'd just appreciate if the slide with the text, that is the text they plan to use, but the text about the Chrome root program update, if you could just not share that until like 2 weeks from now outside of the club,
okay.
I'd appreciate that.
Gotcha. Or would you prefer if we just share the slides in 2 weeks, probably?
You know, I'll just share it without that, and that probably is the easiest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's see. Or actually, Henry, would you happen to have any questions for the audience?
That's
Oh, digesting. Spencer is digesting what he learned just now. Or I guess maybe what would be some advice that you would give for people that are interested or like that are potentially considering research as a career area?
Yeah. No, I think research is a really great career. I think largely my advice with considering research would be to just try your best to get your foot in the door at actually doing it. There's like a lot of I don't know. I mean, what can I say? Like, I think that was just how I got into research. I started doing it and I started getting interested. But the nice thing about research is it's very fun. You can kind of tackle any problem of interest. And we're sort of in a blessed field, I think, for research that you can measure almost anything in the internet. So my advice would be just take something that you're interested in and measure it. And, for all means, that could be a very meaningful study right there. I mean, there's definitely people that do non-measurement research and vulnerability researching and stuff. But largely, I think just trying to get under a professor doing something you're interested in and starting it, or even just doing something, I think would be my best advice. I mean, I mostly started researching by just messing around, and like the first, this latest paper, we got domains straight from Let's Encrypt, but like the paper in 2018, the data in that was just, as an undergrad, I wrote a script that scraped crt.sh, which is actually just scraping certificates for transparency logs. And I just scraped those for domain names, and then I just ran a program that, I forget, I think I must have looked them up. Yeah, I think I just did dig on the domain names. So you can do a surprising amount just with a laptop.
Let's see, we have another question in the chat from Hussein. Are certificate attacks possible with big services by default without extra configuration, such as GitHub pages, especially with consideration for dynamic versus static content?
Yeah, so the beauty of these is that they're incredibly possible and almost everybody's vulnerable to them. So GitHub pages will have a certificate, and then all you would have to do, I think the more difficult part where they try to put more resource in is the BGP side. They try to stop you from making these bad BGP announcements. Now, it turns out those mechanisms are not all that effective, but essentially, it's a very interesting thing. So it matters nothing about what content's on the page. We can launch an attack and get a certificate for it. It matters, quite to people's surprise, it doesn't even matter which certificate authority you go to. So CAs will try to market themselves as like, we're more secure. A DigiCert certificate costs like $300. A Let's Encrypt certificate is free. A Zero SSL certificate is free with a cap of like 10 certificates. So they range like the whole spectrum. I know companies that charge $20 for them, $100. Like, name your price, I can find a company. It turns out it makes no difference which company you go to get the certificate. So GitHub pages might use their favorite super secure CA, but unless they have this very, very, very little known DNS record, and they protect that DNS record with DNSSEC, which almost nobody does, the numbers for the people that are actually secure against this are incredibly low. It doesn't matter how hard they try at security in their own infrastructure. Like, the real beauty of this attack is that we're attacking the network. That connection never even gets to GitHub pages. It gets rerouted to us in the middle of the internet. GitHub never sees it, and then we answer it, we get the certificate, and so it's highly effective against anybody, no matter what the content is. So yeah, actually that MyEtherWallet one, that site was hosted on Amazon, and the attack that got the certificate attacked an Amazon DNS prefix range. So I figure if they're vulnerable to it. Oh, and then one of the more recent ones was, I think it was Seller Bridge. That again was an Amazon prefix range. So people can steal traffic from Amazon and get certificates for services that are running on Amazon. There's really no scale is not a factor in this. So I feel bad. I have to drop fairly soon at 7, but thank you so much for inviting me.
Right. Again, thank you so much for sharing your time with us, especially on a Friday evening. But yeah, overall, thank you again so much for, educating a lot of our student members here, giving them advice, giving them a sneak peek of what it's like to be a researcher kind of thing as well. So again, thank you so much for your time, and have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Same to you guys. And thank you so much for coming to the talk.
Bye, guys. Thank you.